Okay, this is a kind of recap seminar on the long-term causes of World War One. I'm going to be going through chapter headings: the new course in German foreign policy, nationalism, the alliance system and the Triple Entente, the Second Moroccan Crisis, and the Balkans and the Great Powers. So 5 things. Okay. First one, the new course in German foreign policy. Okay. When Bismarck was dismissed, he was replaced by Caprivi, C-A-P-R-I-V-I, Caprivi. Various pressure groups within the Foreign Office, the German Foreign Office, suggested to Caprivi that he not renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. This was a bold strategy, in every sense a new course for German foreign policy. The aim ultimately was to try and force Great Britain into closer ties with Austria and Germany. That was the goal of the new course, to force Great Britain into closer ties with Austria and Germany and Italy. So that's the D, that's the describe. Explanation. Explaining the motivation for this would be, it was believed that the Great British Empire, somewhat correctly, was overstretched and vulnerable, and that therefore Great Britain must have to align itself with someone eventually. It must end its splendid isolation, and Germany wanted it to be them. This was a somewhat misguided approach, however, because the feeling in Britain was that the threat of defending German and Austrian interests against the threat posed by Russia was too great. It would cost too much, economically and militarily, to support an ally with diverse interests like Austria, particularly. Some nice quotes. Caprivi in 1893, "For us, the best opening of the next great war is for the first shot to be fired from a British ship. Then we can be certain of expanding the triple into a quadruple alliance." Okay, that's the idea of drawing Britain closer to Austria, Germany and Italy. A quadruple alliance. Another nice quote from the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. "The liability of having to defend the German and Austrian frontiers against Russia is greater than that of having to defend the British Isles against France." Okay, so that explains the motivation of the two interested parties. Okay, the analysis, the consequences. Germany and Austria were drawn closer together because of this failure of the new course, and we'll look at examples of this failure over the next 20 minutes or so. Because of the failure of this policy, Germany needed Austria's support more than it otherwise would have. It was its main ally, and therefore Austria was able to exert an element of pressure over Germany, particularly with regard to its interests in the Balkans. Okay. Remember, you should be bullet pointing this. Try not to write long extended paragraphs of prose. It should be bullet points. You should just be making nice, succinct little notes.
So Austria took advantage of Germany's position so they could push their interests in the Balkans.
That's right. Another consequence of the new course in German foreign policy was that France and Russia drew closer together. Because Germany was trying to, visibly trying to get closer to Britain, this made Russia and France more wary of Germany, because if the new course succeeded, then France and Russia would really need to be on the defensive. So France and Russia were pulled closer together as a result. The French fleet sailed to Kronstadt, Kronstadt, and this signalled greater military cooperation between the two powers. That was in 1894. And this in turn, this is like a spiral, this kind of knock-on effect, this in turn fueled German fears that in any future conflict, France and Russia would be allies. And imagine, remember where Germany is geographically. If France and Russia are allies, then Germany's sandwiched in the middle of them, a war on two fronts. Okay. Unfortunately for Germany, the next decade or so was dominated not by European interests, but more by imperial rivalries, and it's that we're going to turn to. So in imperial terms, in terms of imperial rivalries, Germany was able to cooperate, or the great powers rather were able to cooperate with one another. So although they might have had these kind of fears for their own security in Europe, in terms of the empires, those were kind of suspended a little bit, and countries that otherwise would be hostile were more able to kind of cooperate with one another. And this was good for Germany's in a very vulnerable position here, okay? But for the next decade or so, the focus is taken away from Europe and onto imperial concerns, okay? It's not really until the Balkan crisis erupts in 1908, really, that Europe becomes the focus again, and that's when long-term causes blend with the trigger event of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. Okay, so that's the new course in a nutshell. Okay, describe, explain, analyze. Done. Okay. Next section. So over the next couple of years, next decade or so, it's really the focus really in foreign policy is empire. This is really a story of Great Britain becoming more strong, becoming strengthened. If you look at the kind of consequences of things like the Fashoda crisis, the Kaiser's response to the Jameson raid and the Boer War, it's really the story of the Anglo-Japanese treaty. It's really a story of Britain becoming more independent of the need for an alliance with Germany, not more in need of an alliance with Germany. Okay, so this imperial story it's really just showing how big a failure that new course in German foreign policy was, right? Okay, the failure to draw Britain into an alliance. So that's what we're looking at. So when we look at, I'll just recap that. When we look at the Fashoda crisis, Jameson raid, the Boer War, and the Anglo-Japanese treaty, and the Russo-Japanese war, it's really the story of the failure of the new course. Because Great Britain is strengthened internationally, not weakened and therefore in need of an alliance with Germany. Is this okay? All right. First of all, the Fashoda crisis. This was a result of French resentment of Britain's dominance in Egypt. It's just imperial rivalries. The French wanted greater power in the Nile region, very sort of fertile region, very economically rich, and also strategically important for access to the Middle East. And the French wanted wanted a piece of this action, basically. The Fashoda crisis was prompted by a French force raising the flag at Fashoda in the Upper Nile region, Fashoda, and then being met by a British force under General Kitchener. Kitchener was a war hero because of his defeat of Sudanese forces at the Battle of Omdurman. The fact that the Sudanese forces were massively outgunned by British technology was neither here nor there, but Kitchener was a hero as far as British public was concerned. Eventually the French sensed that defeat was imminent. There was no significant clash, it was a diplomatic defeat. None of the other countries supported France, the French claim to the Upper Nile region. They had to, there was a humiliating climb down. The French were forced to surrender their interest in the Upper Nile region. But the analysis, that's the explanation, if you like, the motivation of the two countries and a description of what happened. The analysis here is that the long-term effects of the Fashoda crisis were that the French no longer had any reason to conflict with Great Britain in Egypt. Although it was, very humiliating and bad for British and French relations in the short term, in the long term, it meant that there was a greater chance of British and French cooperation in other areas, specifically Morocco.
So is that they didn't have to have conflict again in Egypt?
Yes, no need for conflict in Egypt as a result of the Fashoda crisis. It meant that Britain and France, the French could get British support for their interests in Morocco at a future point, and we'll see with the Moroccan crisis a little bit later on. Again, just to recap, a return to the new course in German foreign policy. This was bad for the new course, right? You can see this was bad for the German objective of getting Britain on side. It might have looked good at the time because Britain and France were coming close to a serious military engagement. But in the long term, when it was resolved, it meant that Britain and France could resolve their differences, and the Germany's opportunities for getting Britain in an alliance were reduced. Okay. Moving on from the Fashoda crisis, the next thing we want to look at is the Jameson raid and the Kaiser's telegram to Paul Kruger. In the first instance, let's start with description. In the first instance, it was a clumsy and illegal attempt to overthrow the Boer government. It was nothing to do with the British government, other than it was sponsored by Cecil Rhodes, who was from Britain. He was British. The motivation for imperial interest in the Transvaal was that gold had been discovered there. Okay, so it was a gold rush, basically. So Cecil Rhodes he was the Prime Minister of Britain's Cape Colony. Sponsored this clumsy and illegal raid to try and overthrow the Boer government. And why was this such a problem internationally? Well, it was massively offensive, apart from anything else, because it was illegal, but particularly for the German-speaking world, because 20% of foreign investment in the Transvaal was German. And German bankers controlled the Transvaal National Bank. So economically, Germany had quite a lot invested in the Transvaal region. So the Jameson raid was a huge affront to German imperial interests. Okay, explaining that then, let's go a little bit further. Germany had to respond. Kaiser Wilhelm was persuaded not to use force because of the danger of the British Navy. So instead, he sent an equally clumsy telegram to Paul Kruger, the Transvaal leader. This, in turn, caused huge resentment in Britain of all things German. So German shops were smashed up by angry mobs and the like. And again, worked against the new course in German politics, reduced the chance of an alliance between Germany, Austria, Italy and Great Britain. Okay, moving on. The next imperial rivalry that I want to address is the Boer War. A few years later, after the Jameson raid, Paul Kruger believed that the opportunity for a continental league against Great Britain had arrived. He really hoped to win widespread support against Great Britain and force them out of South Africa for good. As A.J.P. Taylor, famous historian, has stated, this was a favourable opportunity. That's the language that he uses, a favourable opportunity for a continental league against British domination of South Africa. However, expanding on that, explaining it, there was a total failure of French, German and Russian cooperation. The fear of the British Navy worked again, and as a consequence there was no Continental League. The opportunity to force the sort of British Imperial juggernaut off the tracks was missed, and the British defeated the Boers eventually in 1902. And again, because the British Empire, the opportunity to weaken Britain was missed, the chance of a success in terms of bringing Britain into that alliance with Germany was equally missed. Okay, next imperial area of concern, next imperial focus is China. The Russians were interested in expanding into Manchuria because they wanted an ice-free port in Korea. They had the opportunity to get involved in this neck of the woods because of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which had recently been built, so they could mobilize troops more effectively and quickly. And this upset the balance of power in that region because, again, British interests in Manchuria. So now the British were focused on containing the threat posed by Russia. Russia received the backing of Germany and France. Again, this is an example of countries that are hostile in Europe managing to work together in isolated pockets of imperial interest. Okay, Germany working alongside France and Russia in this instance. So in order to contain the threat posed by Russia, Britain looked to Japan. They signed the Anglo-Japanese Treaty in 1902. The details of this treaty were effectively that they would help one another if attacked by a third party. So if Russia attacked Japan, that's alright. But if a third party became involved, then Britain would have to get involved as well. Okay. Now that was effective because because of the threat of the British Navy, it dissuaded other countries from getting involved in 1905 when the Russo-Japanese War broke out. No assistance for Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Fear of the Great British Navy. Because the Japanese were victorious at the Battle of Tsushima, the sort of ultimate battle, the Waterloo of the Russo-Japanese War, if you like, the Battle of Tsushima, Tsushima. Because the Japanese were victorious, they forced the Russians to kind of cease all pretensions to the region in Manchuria. The Treaty of Portsmouth, as it was known, not Portsmouth in Britain, Portsmouth in America. The Treaty of Portsmouth forced the Russians to kind of look elsewhere, to stop seeking that ice-free port in Manchuria. And consequently, the Russians were no longer a threat to Britain in the Far East. So from 1905, the Russians no longer a threat to Britain in the Far East. And again, this works against the new course. As long as Britain is dominant, as long as Britain is largely unthreatened imperially, then the new course is not working. There's no incentive for Britain to get involved in an alliance with Germany, Austria and Italy. Okay, the third area of long-term causes is the alliance system and the making of the Triple Entente. Remember at this point that Great Britain had settled its differences with France over Fashoda, and there was no imminent threat from Russia following the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. So by 1907, Germany was completely isolated, or Germany and Austria completely isolated from their objective of winning over Great Britain. The new course was failing. Germany and Austria were closer together than they ever had been, and therefore Austria could exert this influence over Germany. It was Germany that was dependent, really, on Austria, strangely, in foreign policy terms. If there had been a war around 1907, it's pretty safe to say that Britain probably would have sided with Russia and France rather than sided with Germany. Why was this? Why would Germany feel closer to Russia and France, despite Fashoda, despite the Anglo-Russian tensions over Manchuria? Why would England have gone over to France and Russia more readily than Germany? It's because of the Anglo-German rivalry, naval and economic. Okay. And because of the clumsy way in which Germany went about the new course, Weltpolitik, Weltpolitik. For example, the Krieger telegram. So to expand really on Anglo-German rivalry, German steel and iron was protected in Germany, which means that the steel and iron industries were booming in Germany. They could undercut rivals by 40%. They were also expanding in the chemical, electrical and engineering industries. So economically, Germany was a powerhouse. Germany had the second largest fleet in the world. Tirpitz, the German admiral, chief of German Navy, had committed to 4 capital ships per year in 1908. 4 capital ships per year in 1908. Germany was the 3rd largest creditor nation. Its banking industry was huge. And German goods were displacing British exports in the Middle East, South America and South Africa. So analysing the consequences of Anglo-German rivalry, people were calling for an end to free trade in Britain, the rise of protectionism, okay, to protect British industry. That's how bad it was. The Navy League in Britain was demanding that the British Navy keep up with German naval arms race. Great Britain the British Navy committed to 18 capital ships in 3 years. Compare that with Tirpitz's 4 capital ships per year. And this in turn, 18 per year, 18 in 3 years. The Navy League extracted this promise from the British Navy of 18 capital ships per year. Tirpitz, by contrast, in Germany, 4 capital ships per year from 1908. Okay. This in turn fueled fears of protectionism in Britain against Germany. So German industry was putting pressure on the German government for military build-up as well. Another reason for the English moving towards France and Russia was the Anglo-French Entente, which came about because of shared interest in Morocco. Remember, the Fashoda crisis removed removed French interest in the Upper Nile region. So now Britain and France were more ready to cooperate in other areas, and this is exemplified by Morocco in 1904. French had designs on Morocco following the Fashoda crisis. Delcasse, Delcasse, was the French foreign minister. Because Morocco was on the verge of civil war, Britain was supportive of French designs on the region. In other words, it was better for British interests that the French controlled Morocco than an independent and potentially hostile Moroccan government. Or civil war, which was the alternative. Remember what's going on at the same time. 1904. The Manchurian crisis. Okay. The French were fearful of having to support Russia in Manchuria. The British were fearful of having to support Japan over Manchuria. Okay? So there were reasons for the two countries to work together elsewhere. Morocco being one of them. Okay? So where you can, try and link contemporaneous events, right? Okay? This is happening, Moroccan crisis 1904, well, it's the same time as the Manchurian crisis. Okay, it's the same time as the Trans-Siberian Railway in Russia trying to expand into Manchuria. So the French and the British had every reason to be closer internationally, and not many reasons not to be closer internationally because of the removal of the threat following the Fashoda crisis. So, the Anglo-French Entente, a little bit of the detail. The French exchanged Newfoundland fishing rights for land in West Africa. Siam was divided, Thailand. Siam was divided into spheres of interest. And a condominium, that's joint governance. A condominium was set up in the New Hebrides. That's Vanuatu to me and you. New Hebrides as it was called then. And there were agreements over spheres of interest in Morocco and Egypt. Okay, so that's the detail. That's the description and the explanation of why they were interested in this area, why they were able to cooperate. The analysis, the consequences of the Anglo-French Entente. As you can imagine, the Germans reacted bitterly to this. It was another slap in the face for the new course. Von Bülow was the Chancellor, and he was very kind of sort of a belligerent character. The Kaiser visited Tangiers in Morocco. He met the Moroccan leader. This, of course, angered the French. It's almost saying it's like the German government was saying that they recognised Morocco as an independent country. To make things worse, the Russians at first, to confuse matters a little bit, I should say, the Russians seemed to support Germany in this. They met with the Germans at Bjorko, Bjorko. They met with the Germans at Bjorko, but the treaty that was signed there was never ratified. But initially, it looked as though the Russians were going to support Germany in trying to upset the apple cart in Morocco. Delcasse was forced to resign. So German and French relations are going down the toilet, basically. However, the British backed the French. They came in on the side of the French at the Algeciras Conference of 1906. Okay, Algeciras, Algeciras. This forced Germany into a humiliating climb down. The only thing that they managed to extract from the Algeciras conference was an agreement that all great powers could have equal economic rights in Morocco. Essentially, it was agreed that Morocco could be governed by the French, who had control over the police force, etc. So Germany was humiliated. This made them ever more eager to win a success diplomatically. It's like Britain is coming out on top repeatedly, and the new course is just getting a hammering. Germany is failing diplomatically in everything it sets out to achieve. Another consequence of the alliance system, the Anglo-French alliance, I should say, and the Moroccan crisis, the Moroccan affair of 1904 and the Algeciras conference, was the Anglo-Russian Entente. Now, why was the Anglo-Russian Entente a consequence of the Anglo-French Entente? Well, remember, Russia and France are allies. It is in Russia's interest to be friends with its friend's friend. So if France is getting closer to Britain, it's in Russia's interest to get closer to Britain as well. Okay? Particularly in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. Remember, this is fresh in the mind. This has only just happened. 1906 Algeciras Conference, 1905 Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War. So this is very, very contemporaneous, right? This is happening at the same time. So Russia needed friends. And it had no longer any reason to compete with Britain over the Far East because of the end of the Russo-Japanese War. So all the more reason to enter into an entente with Britain. But it had its own reasons for wanting to kind of improve relations with Britain. They had other spheres of competition. Afghanistan and Northern India, for example. The Khyber Pass, that kind of area, was very contested. So an agreement between Russia and Britain would ease relations in that area as well. So they reached agreement over Tibet, Afghanistan and Persia, and this signalled this kind of thawing of tension between Russia and Britain. So Russia drawn closer to Britain, France drawn closer to Britain, the exact opposite of what the new course wanted to achieve. Germany increasingly isolated.